So we started with, when talking about creators, we started with YouTube. Now we are going to move into audio. Now let's see if I'm getting better. Wow, I am. If I'm getting better with this, almost. So we probably heard a lot about podcasts. Do you actually listen to podcasts? Who does? Okay, who doesn't yet? Okay, so we still have some couple of listeners to grab, but that's great. So podcasts have been going through, first they were niche, then they were just, some people listened to them, then they got mainstreamized, first of all in different markets, and then especially pandemic was very good to them, but I don't want to spoil a lot of what you will soon hear. So I would like to invite on stage Hanna Nemeckova from Czech Republic. Hello. You work for Seznam. Yeah, come on. Almost there. Yes. There you go. There is your microphone. Yeah, where the right, we see the red dot? No, this one. Okay. So Seznam is the largest online media in Czech Republic. So, but it already says on your first slide, so I don't have to. I don't have to introduce you, so you can share your story. Thank you.
Thank you. So my name is Hanna, and I come to you from Prague, Czech Republic, from Seznam Zprávy, which is actually the largest independent online daily in Czechia. It was founded by Seznam. These are two different entities, but Seznam itself is something that we nicknamed the Czech Google because it started as a local search engine in the 90s and then developed into a news gathering platform. And about 7 years ago, it got its own media ambitions, so they founded Seznam Zprávy, which throughout the years developed into this kind of a deep dive news medium. That means that we have a lot of investigative reporting, analysis, opinion journalism, and of course also podcasts. We are doing podcasts for about 3.5 years, and since then we became the Czech, I would say, leader in the segment of investigative and news and political content in audio. So just to give you a bit of a context how Seznam and Seznam Zprávy are big. Seznam reaches about almost 7 million real or unique users per month, while Seznam Zprávy has an audience of about 4.5 real users monthly. Czech Republic has 11 million of a population and an internet online penetration of about 87%, so Seznam is a really dominant player. And this is our podcast offer. So for the last 3 to 4 years, we've launched between 15 or 20 shows. I haven't counted properly, but the main topics are, of course, politics, investigative reporting. We have also a daily news podcast, and then we have we have also some topically fringe podcasts like a culture podcast, football podcast, satirical podcast, or true crime podcast, which is a very popular genre all around the world in Czechia too, just to have a complete offer, I would say. Our audience is quite big now. It generates about between 2 to 2.5 million downloads or web listens per month. The pink part of the graph are the web-based listens or plays of our podcasts, and the gray part, which is much bigger, is the third-party apps like Spotify, Apple Podcasts. That's where the majority of our audience is, and that's where the audience is still growing. Yeah. So how did it all start? I came to Seznam in September 2019, and by then Seznam had this huge ambition focused on video journalism and also on this idea of having a TV channel combined with text reporting. That idea didn't kind of get off, And by November 2019, they decided to separate the video unit from the rest of the newsroom, and they decided to rebrand the whole media brand as this prestigious quality reading with the most well-known authors in the Czech Republic market and original reporting, something like New York Times, you would say. I came to Seznam that autumn, and I was tasked with audience building and engagement, but nobody told me what it means exactly. So I had social media in charge. I immediately launched some newsletters, but I thought immediately that we have to do podcasts because all of the other Czech media already started experimenting with it, and podcasts are one of the greatest audience or community builders, which we will see after in a few slides. Just to give you an idea about the Czech podcast market at the time, I think we jumped on that podcasting wave at the very last minute, because at the 2019 there were 500 new shows launched in Czechia. And then when the pandemic started, and that was a worldwide trend, the number of new podcasts jumped to over 1,000 that year. So we jumped on that wave, and we are riding it until now. But we'll see how the whole market is going to evolve, because this pandemic bubble is starting to burst a little bit, from which we've seen from the US data. As you can see, the number of new podcasts launched last year compared to the pandemic year of 2020 dropped by 80%. And there's also this another trend, which is going to be super interesting to follow and see how the podcast market is going to evolve, actually. Because there's a lot of layoffs and cutting off staff and investment in the whole media landscape right now in Czechia and in the US. I don't know about the Balkan situation. But for example, Spotify last week, they merged their Gimlet and Barcast podcasting units, and they are cutting off more staff and de-investing in their podcasting business. So we're gonna see how it's going to play out, but for us in Czechia, it's actually good because we've already established a very strong audio brand, so we're gonna see how this turns out. Yeah. So who listens to podcasts in Czechia? Just to give you an idea of the penetration, 60% of people say that they've listened to a podcast once in their life in the Czech Republic. From those 60 people, 7% listen to them daily, 16 couple of times a week, and about 15% once a week. Our audience, specifically related to Seznam Zprávy, is very typical, I would say, for a podcast listener, because it's predominantly male. This is data from Spotify, which is our biggest platform, where we have most of our listenership, and the age bracket is most often between 28 and 34 years of age. This is something that relates to other data that I've seen from other countries, such as Slovakia, which is close to us, or the US. It's also very useful for our sales department, because when they say that the usual consumer is male, millennial, educated from bigger cities, who is interested in the events around him, that's a good demographic that your clients will listen to, or it seems. Okay. Mom. Yeah. So, to our production. The first show that we experimented with and launched, we were very lucky because it became a hit almost immediately. At that time, most of the podcasts in the Czech Republic were just interviews. People asking another people, usually 30 minutes or 1 hour long. And I was kind of keen on this idea of pairing two hosts, discussing one topic and showing their expertise in a, I would say, friendly or informal way. And because our main topic is politics, and I knew that there was Lucie Stuchlíková and Vašek Dolejší, who are very experienced political reporters, and they also had their video show X'd, so they were a bit depressed. So I came to them and said, hey guys, I like listening to you when you're discussing some behind-the-scenes political stuff in the kitchenette, in the newsroom, and so let's go to the studio and try to bring this atmosphere to the studio and to audio. And they were like, okay. And what was amazing that the listeners reacted almost immediately to the atmosphere of the podcast and to the chemistry between the two reporters. Of course, it's an information-loaded podcast. It's not just chit-chat. It's not just gossip, although the gossip part is very, very important. And I think that this podcast showed our Czech colleagues that you can discuss politics in an informal, I'm not saying in a tabloid way, but in an informal way, and that the listeners really like it. If I'm gonna continue and tell you about our production models, there are a few ways. How we approach launching new shows. So this example was when we were working with our internal talent, when we scoped that there are two talented people that would be good on audio and that have already a relationship. We've also combined external talent with internal talent. For example, in our personal finance show called Ve Vatě, we've combined our business journalist Markéta Bidermanová with the then very well-known investor Radovan Vávra. Also, they were discussing the money matters in a more informal way, and it was also very successful. Nosiči vody is a football podcast, and there you can listen to one of the most renowned Czech football commentators combined with our own football expert from our newsroom. Then there's another category that I call or nickname a must-have, because when you have a catch-all a news server like Seznam Zprávy is, there just are some formats that you have to serve most of your audience. One of them is a daily podcast, a daily news podcast. The 559 podcast is modeled on the Daily by the New York Times. I will talk about it a bit more later. Then we also have a Hard Talk political interview where we managed to attract Marie Baslova from Czech Public Radio to interview Czech politicians in a very direct and consistent way every day. We broadcast it also as a video, which is very important today to have a video part, but this is mostly a video format that we reuse as a podcast show too. Another production model, which I would like to show you, but is something that we call the blockbusters. Those are usually limited series or shows that have a higher production value, but also a great listener response. These shows, like if I say it in other words, these shows are more expensive to make because you need an original script. We work with original sound design. We work with actors sometimes and audio archives. And usually these shows are limited series, about 10 episodes max. And actually the show České podsvětí, which is Czech Underground in English, is our most successful show to date. It has over 5 million listens in total. And it's actually a true crime series about the darker side of the 1990s in the Czech Republic when the organization crime started to grow. And there we combined the matador of Czech investigative reporting, Pepa Klíma, with a young YouTuber Adam Miklica, that we discovered on YouTube, and he was having a show about a very similar topic like Pepa originally reported in the 1990s. And this show was actually the biggest age listening bracket of the audience was 18 to 22 years old. It was a hit between youngsters who were fascinated with this part of history and rediscovered actually the work of Pepa Klíma afterwards. Yeah, and the last part, sorry, I suck with this clicker. Yeah, is content exchange. This is something that we do to help ourselves, but also to different Czech NGOs, because even NGOs have podcasts. It's a very usual thing. So sometimes when the shows, when we see a new up-and-coming show that we would like to support, we offer them our website as a distribution platform. Yeah, monetization is something that we have to touch because, as I mentioned earlier, the financial situation in the media in general is can be a bit depressing. So you have to think about your monetization model first. In Seznam Zprávy, it was a bit predisposed that we wouldn't have a subscription-based model, but we will have an ad-based model because all of our content is free and ad-based. So we follow the same model in audio too. The first way to monetize our content is through our web, because on this web we have our own audio player where we can dynamically insert and distribute audio ads throughout all of our web content, audio content. Sorry, you can the clients can buy advertising exclusive to one show or floating throughout all of our shows. The spots are usually short, about 20 seconds. And usually those are radio spots because Seznam also has 2 radio stations. So the sales team is trying to sell the same type of ad to 2 different mediums. Maybe if I have time, I will mention it more on later. But as I've shown you before, most of our listenership is in the third-party apps, and luckily our podcast hosting system, we use Transistor, allows us to build simple campaigns, usually with a pre-roll and a mid-roll distributed, and the ad listening performance is actually very good. It's better than on the web, but sometimes we have some very angry Spotify users writing to us because they're paying the premium version and they don't understand the fact that even podcast producers, independent podcast producers, can insert their own ads in their podcast. So sometimes we have some funny or tense exchanges on Twitter with them. Okay, so now to the most final part. What have you learned so far? Well, the first thing that we've learned is that, as I mentioned, we have a lot of podcasts, and to some newsrooms or media brands, it can seem a lot because usually media brands have one flagship podcast or like a few of them. Right now we have about 10 regular shows. I would say as long as you're growing, it's not a bad thing to have that many podcasts. We are still growing year to year, year on year. We've grown by 150% or something like that in total all across the platforms. And by having different shows, you have different audiences, you reach different communities, you reach different demographics. And also you're not threatened when a major star or the host of your podcast decides to leave your organization, or the format just simply runs its course. For example, the personal finance podcast Ve Vatě, we had to relaunch it with a different expert next to Markéta, because Mr. Vávra launched a new investment endeavor which was in conflict of interests with our show. Angličan was a show about Premier League, and unfortunately this colleague of mine became the main actor in a sexual harassment case in our newsroom. So of course this show was immediately discontinued, and there was like no question of even about continuing once everything surfaced up. And Kulturák was a very nice culture, digital culture and pop culture show, but the audience was lovely but very small compared to the KPIs that we had for this show and for the rest of our shows. So we had to discontinue it after about a year. Another thing, or another very interesting experience. Jeez, I don't know what happened. Back. Once more, yeah. Was with our daily news podcast, 559. I mentioned it a bit earlier that it's kind of a version on or riff on the Daily by the New York Times. And actually, it's a brand or a team that we've acquired. The host Lenka Kabrhelová is a very successful Czech public radio personality, and there at the Czech Public Radio, she launched the first podcast of this kind called Vinohradská 12, and she established a whole team and workflow around this show. But after a few years, she came dissatisfied with the working conditions at the Czech Public Radio, so we offered her and the whole team to come over to our newsroom and launch a very similar show. But still, even though we had the host, even though we had the know-how, we still had to build everything from scratch, because we realized pretty soon that the first show called Vinohradská 12, which continued on with another host, retained a lot of its original audience, and that we were actually fighting for the same audience with that podcast. So that led to more experimentation on the part of Lenka's team, and I think it was a great learning experience overall, but also a realization that the market is becoming more and more saturated, and then you're just fighting for the same people and their attention and their time. One of the greatest experiences definitely is live taping. It's something that the hosts and the listeners love both. The podcasting experience for journalists can be a bit isolating one, maybe, because you spend a lot of time in the studio, you don't get to see your listeners, but you just hear or read their feedback. And to meet them and discuss with them something face-to-face is invaluable, and also a very nice realization when there's like 400 people that come to see you because they love your show. And it goes both ways, because the fans really want to just hang out with the hosts and share some thoughts with them, give them feedback personally. And that's something that was also seen in the digital space during the pandemic. We've experimented a lot with Twitter Spaces and live audio, which isn't the same as the live experience, of course, but at least it's a two-way thing, because people can discuss together, and that's something that the podcasting shows and listeners love. There's also the possibility of recording the live taping, of course. I have to say, after you hear a few of them, they're not that great, actually, because usually they're longer. The hosts are repeating the same thing that they've already said in their regular show, and they're a bit high on adrenaline, so sometimes their performance is not that great. But hey, it's a free episode, so if you want it, use it. And the last observation that we've learned, or that I have, is trust. It's something that I've mentioned earlier or throughout the presentation, is that the podcast journalists or hosts are very connected to their audience and their listeners, and it goes vice versa. I've also found this statistic by Pew Research, which confirms that podcasts or audio journalists are much more connected to their audience than TV journalists or online journalists, for that matter. And so sometimes feedback in the news media can be easily dismissed, especially when it comes on social media. But for the podcast journalists or audio journalists, I would say that they value this feedback much more. And I mentioned in the beginning, or in the monetization part, that our sales team strategy was to use the same ads, the radio ads, and as the podcast ads. But the radio ads are a bit different. You know, in radio, the ad has to be more dynamic, louder. The host usually screams at you in a way. And our podcast listeners actually didn't like it, and they sent us immense feedback on these two campaigns that followed, and that were just very radio specific. So we with the podcast journalist, with our podcast host, we took that feedback and wrote, together with the sales department, we wrote a manual to our clients how to build and record better podcast ads. And we have a few first successful case studies that the listeners actually listen to these types of apps longer and have a greater response to the message of the ads. So yeah, it goes both ways. And that's everything. So any questions?
Thank you very much. Sorry for the remote struggle. Okay, guys, please find Hanna during the break, because right now we are breaking for lunch, which is going to happen for those who are here not for the first time. It's the usual place, Piwnica, which is, I think, like 7 minutes walking from here. Just follow the crowd. And then we are gathering again at what, 3 p.m., Olya? Yes, 3 p.m. we resume. Thank you very much for this part. Bye-bye.